Its graphic forms, bold colours and catchy slogans are part of the African visual landscape. Wax print fabrics, or Ankara, have spread beyond their origins in West Africa and are now ubiquitous across the continent. We'll be talking to artist Thandiwe Muriu about her use of the material in just a moment, as a new exhibition here in Paris is taking an anthropological look at this emblematic cloth. Well, originally inspired by Indonesian batik, which uses wax to block parts of the fabric during the dyeing process, European traders and colonial powers brought Ankara to African markets in the 19th century, establishing a lucrative industry. Well, this latest show means that visitors are seeing it in a whole new light. Let's hear from them.
It's crazy to see that behind every pattern, behind every fabric, there's symbolism, there's a little phrase, there's a story.
Wax is actually part of my culture. I'm from Mali, and it's a fabric that's really used over there, whether it's for everyday wear, parties or celebrations.
I think it's also a way to encourage younger generations to reappropriate this material, this fabric, which is not so easy to wear in everyday life.
Well, for more on the symbolic and aesthetic reach of this fabric, we're going to speak to Thandiwe Muriu, who's long used Ankara in her artwork, which has been exhibited at galleries in Nairobi, London, Paris, and last year at the Venice Biennale. Thandiwe, thanks so much for joining us. Now, we can see your work in this exhibition. Those portraits, we see your subjects appear to dissolve into the background thanks to the use of fabric. Tell us a bit about this stylistic choice, which is a signature in your work. How did you develop this practice?
I think it all began with the question of who am I and how do I want to express myself? And ironically, I found an answer in a cloth that is not original to Kenya, but that we wear and is very much part of our culture. The Ankara fabric, if you ask Kenyans, they'll say it comes from West Africa, even if its origins are from elsewhere. And we borrowed this cloth from the West African part of the region. And we wear it for special occasions when we want to look our best. Many times you might find a woman choosing a fabric and then dressing her family in outfits made from the same fabric so that the whole family matches. And I think for me, it was a very powerful visual way to express identity and taste and preference as a woman. And so I was deeply inspired to use it in my work to begin to address questions on womanhood and identity and being a modern woman in a more traditional context.
Yeah, and those are ideas that are certainly present in your book of photographs, portraits, which was published last year with the title Camo. A very interesting word, often used to mean sort of camouflage. What do you think that it says in terms of a commentary about women's visibility in your work and then in society?
I think in many regions in the world, women are often invisible contributors to society. And I very much felt that way in my own journey in becoming a photographer and then an artist based in Kenya. Being a photographer was a very unusual thing for women to do. And I definitely struggled with the pressure of feeling a little bit like my community or my culture wanted me to be invisible, just to be the perfect wife and maybe to be the perfect mother. And yet what happens if I want to be more, or if I'm capable of being more than that? And these are questions I wrestled with. My particular desire to use the Ankara textile stems from its history as a cloth of empowerment. This cloth is very much worn by women, and so it's a way that they can communicate with their community because the symbols have meanings. There's a language on this cloth. But even beyond giving women a voice, this cloth economically empowered women. Historically, I'm thinking of the Nana wax, the women in Togo from the 1960s to the 1990s who found wealth and influence from selling this cloth. And so it was perfect for me to use this cloth that had empowered women for years, for generations, to begin to find empowerment myself as a woman who felt invisible and yet had a deep desire to be visible.
Amazing. As you say, there's that stylistic power and also that social function and that social status that it has bestowed upon women in the past. Well, given its origins, some Africans have rejected Ankara as an example of the colonial domination they've been subjected to. Others have seen an economic opportunity. For example, President Thomas Sankara sought to nationalize the fabric's production in Burkina Faso when he came to power. And when it comes to the expressive motifs printed onto the cloth, they often convey messages about family, identity, and indeed politics, something that's not been lost on electoral candidates over the years. Here's more from the curator of that exhibition.
It has also become a tool for propaganda, and that's where its political role becomes very blurry, because there have been many, many presidents, and some of them lifelong presidents, who had their portraits printed onto African wax fabrics every time there's an election, with their slogan printed on it too. It's a great communication strategy. People are walking around town wearing their image. It's better than a poster, in fact.
Indeed, African motifs and Ankara can be instrumentalized for political reasons, but also a platform for passing on messages about public health, social values. I know that the traditional Kenyan fabric, kanga, also has that expressive potential using text as well as images. You've made artwork based on that cloth. Can you tell us about some of the messages in that series, Woven Voices, what you wanted to highlight there?
It's interesting that this exhibition about the wax textile ties so deeply into the new series I'm exploring, Woven Voices. Like I said before, in East Africa, we don't really have any symbolism attached, or there's no language for us attached to the wax textile. But the language of cloth is deeply ingrained in the kanga textile. And it has been used for generations as a way for women to converse with their communities. And so as I began my work with the wax textile, I began to have a longing, maybe deep questions about, is there an East African cloth that is as powerful a record of history and empowerment as a wax textile? And I found the answer in the kanga. And in Camo, my original work, I was asking questions about my place as an individual in a community. But in Woven Voices, I begin to ask questions about a community's place in the global landscape. And the incredible thing about many textiles in Africa is they're records of history. We didn't tend to write books. We tended to weave textiles or create textiles that recorded our experiences over time. But even beyond that, these textiles are very much so a record of Africa's relationship with the world. I think very much of the Maasai fabric called the Maasai shuka, and that was so deeply influenced by the Scottish tartan, for example. And so these textiles are just an exchange of how we see ourselves and how we want to express ourselves. But they also are a way for us to talk about how we relate with the world and the influence the world has had on us and our identity. And so I wanted to explore the idea of communal self-bias and communities devaluing themselves when it comes to the global landscape and the global platform.
Indeed, they tell a very rich story. And African motifs and fabrics are increasingly being used in contemporary fashion. We've been speaking to one designer based here in Paris who produces her creations in Ivory Coast. Laurence Erline tells us why Ankara often features in her pieces.
I'd say we're in a moment of colour and vitality. There's a lot of energy and life in wax print fabrics. And then there's a very playful side too. So let me show you this ensemble which brings together the wax print fabric that I paired with raffia in this shirt and mini short outfit. So there you have it, bringing wax print fabric and totally natural materials together, but with a more contemporary perspective that still retains its authenticity.
Thandiwe, we see Ankara being used a bit more now in international fashion. It's quite trendy. How do you feel about these fabrics, kanga, Ankara, or even Ghanaian kente, for example, being used in Western designs as a fashion choice? Is it a bit trivial? Do you see it as a tribute or cultural appropriation?
I think it's part of the journey of a textile. Textiles come from cultures, go into different cultures, they're transformed by different cultures. And so again, it's a symbol of how interconnected we are as a world. I think very much so as a modern African, I recognize that I wouldn't want to wear these textiles the way maybe they were traditionally worn. I personally tend to wear this textile in very Western cuts and clothing. And so I guess it's part of the experience of a textile and sharing our textile culture with the world. However, I do think it is important to credit the messaging or the symbolism in the textile, or to work with African-based designers to create these textiles and preserve the authenticity of the cloth itself.
Which is something I know that you do for the pieces that you create subsequently. Thandiwe, thank you so much for speaking to us today. And we're wrapping up the show with a graphic novel that tells the story of a young design student named Sophia. And to a certain extent, it tells the story of the Ankara fabric too. Wax Paradox is an exploration of the interwoven history between Europe and Africa and the search for identity. It comes from Belgian author and illustrator Justine So. We'll leave you with a glimpse of that book. Otherwise, the exhibition Wax is on at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris until September this year. See you next time here on Ars 24.